Cy Vance is someone who has consistently failed to hold people who are in positions of power or who are wealthy and well-connected accountable. He's the person who didn't prosecute Harvey Weinstein for 6 years, despite having recorded evidence. He argued for leniency for Jeffrey Epstein. As Manhattan DA, you have the power to prosecute crimes that are committed within Manhattan. Obviously, I would look at the facts and the law and apply it fairly, but I'm saying that people like the Trumps don't get a different set of rules.
Welcome to the Bullish Podcast. Before we begin, please subscribe to Bullish and like this video. Today, we have a very special interview. We're interviewing Eliza Orlins, who's a public defender who's running for Manhattan District DA. She's running against Cy Vance Jr., a man who's occupied the position for about 10 years. The position is super important because of its jurisdiction. It presides over one of the most important, powerful, concentrated areas of wealth in the country, Manhattan. Many people have criticized Cy for his handling of the investigations of Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, and some of the Trump cases. And Eliza has a lot of interesting things to say. The election takes place next June 2021. So if you live in Manhattan, you can still register to vote. This is a race that we're going to be watching closely. We'd like to speak with all of the candidates. So if you're part of any of those campaigns, please reach out to us. We shot this interview before the 2020 presidential election. It doesn't change much, but I just wanted to set that for context. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Hi, how are you?
Eliza, how's it going?
Pretty good. How about you?
Doing all right. Can you tell us very briefly, what does a district attorney do?
I usually tell people that a district attorney is the most important elected official that they don't know. DAs have so much power. They make all charging decisions with regards to every criminal case brought in the city that they represent. So not only what crime gets charged, but who gets charged and who doesn't, the sentences that are sought, whether someone has the opportunity for a treatment program or an alternative to incarceration, bail amounts are asked for, the charges, and every decision with regards to a prosecution.
Can you tell us a little bit about what makes the Manhattan DA special?
Yeah, in the Manhattan District Attorney is particularly important because Manhattan includes the financial center of our country, basically. It includes Wall Street. It includes so many places. And people really look to Manhattan as kind of an example. So if Manhattan is doing things policy-wise that are troubling, then those policies get adopted across the country. And if Manhattan is doing things that are fair and just, hopefully those things would get adopted throughout the country as well. You can't change the system without changing the DA because the DA is the person who has all the power to affect real change in the system. And right now, we don't have a system of justice. We have a criminal legal system that is cruel and unjust. And in fact, it doesn't make us safer. And I've spent over a decade as a public defender going up against this cruel, unjust system and realized that you can't fix the problem unless you are inside of it to really affect change.
Was there a particular time when you had that aha moment?
It's funny. I actually did not have one specific moment that made me realize that I wanted to run. It was really just a buildup of over a decade of frustration and heartbreak and anger at seeing the way the system operated and realizing that I had no power to change it as a public defender. I think it's really been something that has existed from, very early on in my career. My first year as a public defender, I remember I walked into night court and I met a man who I'll call John. And John worked as an assistant manager at a Gristedes, which is a supermarket in Lower Manhattan. And he'd worked at the same supermarket for 25 years and he'd made his way up to assistant manager. And one night he was closing up the store. It was like around 11 p.m. And he bought 2 bags of groceries for his family with his employee discount to bring home. And he walked over to the subway to head home and he puts the bags on the seats next to him and prepares for his long ride home. There's hardly anyone on the train, and he's just sitting there, not doing anything. At the 125th Street stop, 2 uniformed NYPD officers get on the train. They grab John's groceries, dump them to the ground, and place him in handcuffs and proceed to take him to jail for the night for the crime of occupying multiple seats on a transit facility, taking up 2 seats on the train. And so I met him the next night and I got him out of jail. But that frustration and heartbreak and anger about the way the system operates really never went away. And I recognized that this is exactly why we need to change the system. After a decade of representing people who are moms and dads and sisters and brothers and people's children, that the system is working exactly as designed. You'll hear people say, oh, our criminal justice system is broken. But I say it's not broken. It's working as designed and disenfranchising the very people it was designed to disenfranchise. And meanwhile, it's rigged in favor of those who are wealthy, powerful, well-connected. And that's what really prompted me to make this decision to run.
Are there DAs around the country that you respect?
The current Manhattan DA has really perpetuated this lock them up, throw away the key mentality. And they really just continue to dehumanize people on every level. It starts with even the language they use. They refer to people as case numbers or criminals, felons, inmates, prisoners, bodies. Even the language, it's just completely dehumanizing. And I think, a real transformational change would be having a public defender as DA who really thinks about the humanity in each person, who looks at people as people and thinks about how we can help them and make sure they have the resources they need, the services they need, the treatment they need, and not just think about being a punitive, person who continues to prop up this system of mass incarceration.
Can you talk a little bit about how people get stuck in the system, how someone will get caught for a pretty, minor crime that then escalates?
The system really does cycle people through. It's something that has such a terrible recidivism effect because of the way in which it operates. So if someone's locked up for whether it be 3 months, 3 weeks, or even just 3 days, that person becomes exponentially more likely to reoffend or get rearrested. And it makes sense if you think about it, because that person, even if you're just locked up for a few days, you lose your job because you miss work for those days. Then you lose your home. You can't afford to pay your rent. If you're a single parent, you lose your kids to foster care. So of course, then it becomes a situation where you have your life is completely ruined. Everything you've ever worked for is upended. And, a lot of things that we do, especially incarcerating people, do nothing to address the issues they're facing. If they're experiencing homelessness or poverty or mental health issues or substance use disorder, locking them up is not fixing any of that. It's not addressing the underlying issues for anyone. And it's actually making it more likely that they're going to end up back in the system. I represented a young woman, a teenager named Jessica, a handful of years ago, and she was charged with possessing a gun. And, she was dealing with a lot of things in her life, but they caught her with a gun. And, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office wanted only to see a jail sentence. They wouldn't, no matter how much we begged and pleaded, and despite our pleas for mercy, they only wanted to lock her up. And thankfully, we came before a judge who said, okay, I'll give her a chance. I'll give her an opportunity to participate in an alternative to incarceration. And so Jessica entered this program and had to come back with letters and monthly updates. And she kept coming back with these updates saying she was just really excelling in the program, that she was doing incredibly well, that she was attending for more hours than she was even mandated to, that she had become a mentor to other kids in the program. And then I remember the day she brought her certificate of completion, and the judge called us up to the bench and just said, I'm so proud of both of you. I'm so glad to see this, and just, this is so amazing. I see hundreds of cases every week, but this one has really stuck with me. And I'm just so proud of the progress you've made, Jessica and Eliza. You were just such an incredible advocate. And I was like, no, Judge, this was because of you. This was thanks to you taking a chance on Jessica. And she's like, no, this is because of you. I mean, it was just like this beautiful thing. We were all kind of teary. And she's like, but I hope that Jessica will continue down the right path. And about 2 years later, I got a call from Jessica's girlfriend saying, hey, I'm not sure if you remember us. And I was like, of course I do. Oh my God, how is everything? What's going on? And she's like, well, we know you're super busy. And I'm like, no, what is it? Anything. And she's like, well, Jessica's actually graduating from high school and we have an extra ticket to graduation. And it would mean so much if you would be there. And I was like, I wouldn't miss it for the world. And so I called the judge's chambers to let her know that Jessica was graduating and just to give her the update. And she said, oh, do they have an extra ticket for me too? And so we both end up attending graduation. The principal hears that we're coming and asks us both to speak at graduation. Wow. And so it was just so beautiful. And I mean, we were crying. I was crying as though my own child was graduating from high school. It was truly amazing. And Jessica's, now gainfully employed. She's engaged and she has a baby on the way.
Wow. That's amazing that you have such a...
It's amazing. And, it's one of the cases that really stands out to me as a case where, people think of gun possession and, gun violence as being something that can only be addressed with punitive measures. And I think that something like Jessica's case really shows what good we can do when we actually do address these issues and don't just lock people up without thinking about it, without addressing it, because, we set her down a completely different path and she's doing incredibly well.
So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about the person who is currently occupying the role of Manhattan District DA.
Oh, absolutely. So the current occupant of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office is a man by the name of Cy Vance Jr. And he is someone who has always given breaks to the rich, powerful, well-connected. He's someone who has disproportionately locked up poor people, people of color, LGBTQIA folks without really any regard for them. And meanwhile, really just done favors for those he considers to be in his social circles. He has, not really given people treatment when they are in need of treatment. He doesn't think about, the humanity of each person. And so I really have been an outspoken critic of his for the last 11 years. And I think, running against him has been really like almost even the natural next step because of how critical I've been of all of his actions and policies.
And so he's currently involved heavily in one of the Trump tax return cases. And can you tell us a little bit about what's been going on with that? It's really confusing to follow. So can you just give us a quick summary?
Yes. Well, I probably shouldn't talk about the details of, an open matter, but Cy Vance is the person who is, seeking Trump's tax returns. The thing I would say with regards to that is that, Cy Vance could have done this much sooner. He could have prosecuted the Trump kids. There was, what seems to have been overwhelming evidence of fraud with regards to the Trump Soho back in 2012. He's a person who's routinely not gone after these big cases. And so, yes, while he's currently apparently doing that, he's really dragged his feet on it a great deal.
And of course, speaking of dragging your feet, can you talk a little bit about how people like Epstein and Weinstein, what's their legal strategy for getting away with what they do, and how do they use guys like Cy as part of their strategy?
Well, so, Cy Vance is someone who has consistently failed to hold people who are in positions of power or who are wealthy and well-connected accountable. He's the person who didn't prosecute Harvey Weinstein for 6 years, despite having recorded evidence that he had committed sexual assaults. He argued for leniency for Jeffrey Epstein. He gave a sweetheart deal to Dr. Robert Haddon, that Columbia OBGYN who sexually assaulted what we thought at the time was dozens of his patients, but may have been hundreds of women. This is a person who has consistently failed to hold these people accountable. And, the same goes for the police. He really fails to hold police officers accountable, he, instead of using his power to do that, he's instead protected and shielded the police and, not made our city safer as a result.
Can you talk a little bit about how campaign donations play into DA's decision-making sometimes, or could potentially influence those?
I think that the campaign finance laws in New York are pretty egregious. The maximum donation you can give if you wanted to give to, a presidential primary in the US is $2,800. For my race, an individual donor can give up to $35,000. So, people can take these massive donations and then do favors for their for their donors. The same goes for taking corporate donations or corporate PAC money or police union money and then not hold those people accountable. It's a huge problem.
Do you think that our society fully understands the idea of corruption and its impact on our lives?
That's an interesting question. I think that corruption is a much bigger problem than people realize, and that it's so interesting the way in which certain people consistently get away with the crimes they commit, whereas others don't. One of the things that I frequently talk about is the fact that as a public defender, I represented plenty of people who were charged with theft, charged with stealing, petty theft, whatever, for stealing, let's say, a pint of ice cream from a CVS, which is worth about $4.99. Meanwhile, there are employers out there who are skimming off the top of their employees' paychecks, who are stealing from their employees, committing wage theft to the tune of millions of dollars, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and they are not being held accountable. They're not being prosecuted.
One of the things that really interests me about corruption is how it starts to affect things on a macroeconomic level. As more blood money comes into our economy, we have to start competing with that. And so things like rent go up, medical costs go up, cost of living goes up. Wondering if you had a take on that and how you would approach those issues as DA.
Well, when people are engaging in these corrupt practices and essentially stealing and laundering money and doing all of these things, the people who they are hurting are often the most marginalized people in society. It's usually people who don't have the power to fight back. It's Black and brown people, it's lower income folks, it's non-citizens. And so it really does. It has this trickle down effect where people can't afford their rents, they get squeezed out, they get coerced, their landlords take advantage of them, their employers take advantage of them, and it hurts the little guys. It hurts everyday working New Yorkers.
You had some really strong words for Ivanka Trump. I was wondering if you could tell us why.
As Manhattan DA, you have the power to prosecute crimes that are committed within Manhattan. And I think that, obviously I would look at the facts and the law and apply it fairly. But I'm saying that people like the Trumps don't get a different set of rules than everyone else. I would hold them accountable just as I would anyone else who were to commit crimes in this city. And so, that's just the reality of it. And Cy Vance has not done that.
Why do you think he's not doing it? Like, what's his deal?
Cy Vance is someone who has always been a friend to the rich and powerful, to the wealthy and well-connected. He's someone who runs in the same social circles. He's someone who has always done favors for them and therefore failed to hold them accountable. I think that's why we need a different kind of district attorney. And, having someone who has spent her career as a public defender, I would really bring the bold transformational change we need to see in the Manhattan DA's office.
Can you tell us what you do in your first 30 to 100 days?
Definitely. So I think the most important things that we need to do are decriminalize poverty. We, for far too long, have locked people up simply because they can't afford to buy their freedom, or for crimes of poverty, for homelessness, for taking up 2 seats on the subway, for sleeping on a park bench. So the policies I would enact on day one would end those practices. I would no longer seek cash bail. Cash bail is incredibly coercive. It forces pleas. It ends up, hurting people. It makes them, as I said before, lose their jobs, lose their homes, lose their families. And it's really just based on the amount of money in someone's bank account. It has nothing to do with the crimes they're charged with. It has nothing to do with their likelihood of returning to court, which is truly the purpose of bail. And so, I would just end all of those practices. I would decriminalize low-level drug possession, decriminalize sex work, and make sure that we are protecting the vulnerable members of our city instead of prosecuting and incarcerating them. I would favor rehabilitation over incarceration. I would change the practices of the Manhattan DA's office to make it the rule rather than the exception that someone receive treatment who needs it. And so many more things that really desperately need to change.
What's your stance on cannabis?
Oh God, I have been such an outspoken advocate for the legalization of cannabis for such a long time. It's absolutely infuriating to me the way in which it's prosecuted. It should not be. I actually think we need to decriminalize all drug possession, but cannabis specifically has been used to disproportionately lock up people of color. Has really been absolutely horrendous for people's lives. It has excluded people from housing. It has done all these things by giving someone a criminal record. And I remember, Cy Vance made this big announcement back in 2018. We are no longer going to prosecute marijuana cases. And that very day that he had this big press conference, brought in all these news cameras and had these positive articles written about him saying that he was no longer going to prosecute these cases, I walked into night court that very night, long after the cameras had left the building. And I walk in, and the first case I pick up is a gentleman who's been incarcerated for 23 hours for nothing more than possessing marijuana. So I was filled with rage, obviously, and I took to Twitter because that's, where I said, and I'd seen all these articles. And so I'm at Vice, at Gothamist, at all these news places. And I'm like, you covered Cy Vance doing this big announcement. Well, just so you know, there's a person who's incarcerated, who's been in for almost 24 hours, who has done nothing more than possess marijuana. So, this is something that I think you should correct the record. So anyhow, Cy Vance's comms person sees this and sends me a direct message and says, "Oh, Miss Orlins, can you please send me the docket number?" And I think I in my mind, thought he was questioning the veracity of my tweet. And I'm like, yes, it's docket, ending in 333. And before I know it, I'm just doing my job. I'm speaking to people and I'm interviewing folks. I'm in and out of the jail. And all of a sudden they're like, "Who's the attorney on docket ending in 333? And I'm like, "Oh, that's my case. Why?" And they're like, "We're calling that case." So they call the case and they're like, "The people move to dismiss in the interest of justice." And they dismiss the case. And the clerk is cracking up and she's like, "Miss Orlins, did you just get a case dismissed on Twitter?" And I'm like, that is not how justice should work. We were laughing about it, but the reality is these cases are still being prosecuted and they should not be under any circumstances. So it would certainly be my office policy not to ever prosecute cannabis cases.
Can you talk a little bit about how cannabis plays in with stop and frisk? It seems like there's a pattern of, someone will get stopped and frisked on the subway. They don't find a gun. They do find a small amount of marijuana. That becomes something that, changes that person's life forever, which wasn't the purpose of stop and frisk.
Yeah. So the problem with stop and frisk is that, of course, millions of young men of color were searched and stopped and frisked based on these horrible practices. But then even if they were only found with just a tiny bit of marijuana, they would basically be entered into the system. They'd be incarcerated. They would sometimes get a criminal record off of it. And then it impacts the rest of their lives. Even if you only spend one night in jail, a criminal record sometimes sentences you to a lifetime of unemployment, or you can't get financial aid for school. You can't get into certain housing. You can't get certain jobs. So this has a huge impact on people's lives, and it all starts from just minor possession of cannabis.
At a recent debate, you were talking about trial tax and how you would end that. Can you tell us what that is and why you want to end it?
Yes. So as a public defender for over 10 years, I represented over 3,000 people, and very few of those cases ended up going to trial. And there's a reason for that. The system is not designed for trials, despite the fact that that's what you see in the media. That's what you see on Law and Order. Every case goes to trial. That's not what happens in reality, because in reality, the DA has all the power. And so the DA will say, "Oh, right now I'm offering you probation, but if you go to trial, you're going to prison for minimum 5 years. Or right now I'm offering you community service, but if you go to trial, you're going to jail for at least a year." And so the fear of going to trial is this trial tax. So even if you're innocent, even if you want to fight the case, even if you say, "Well, the crime they're charging me with, I'm not guilty of, even if maybe I was guilty of something lesser," you can't take that risk because of this trial tax. And the trial tax is so huge and the risk is so great for so many people that 90+% of cases end up in a plea of some sort because the trial tax. And I think this practice is completely unfair, completely unjust, and I would end it, as Manhattan District Attorney.
One of the things I think is really interesting in the police brutality issue is the lack of transparency that local governments have for police records. For instance, I just found out in California, there was a big Supreme Court case that just passed that gave local city officials access to police records. So before that, there would be district attorneys who were using police who had a record of corruption or had a record of brutality. They were using them as witnesses and didn't even know. So it created this whole other layer of corruption. It just kind of like blew my mind that like in 2020, up until this point, like a DA would have no access to the police record of someone they were even using as a witness.
There is so much police misconduct. And I saw it firsthand as a public defender. I saw, not only did I see perjury in the courtroom and falsifying documents, but also false arrests and physical abuse. You should see my camera roll is filled with photographs of my clients that I took at arraignments who had gashes on their faces or bloody bruised, and I said, how did this happen? And they said, the police. And these were all the types of police misconduct that I would see. And yet the district attorney's office just routinely would hide the records from us, would not show any of the, even despite litigation, despite requirements, they would just withhold this. Police who've lied on the stand, police who have known instances of misconduct where the city has had to pay out, thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars based on this misconduct. And they would just deliberately hide that evidence from us. And that erodes public trust, that hurts communities. And, the Manhattan DA has really been complicit in this continuing misconduct perpetrated by the NYPD and used his power to shield the police instead of holding them accountable. And so it's so important, and my understanding of this comes from my firsthand experience as a public defender. And so when I'm Manhattan District Attorney, police misconduct will not be tolerated. And I will have a dedicated unit designed for prosecuting police officers. And that's really how we'll keep our communities safer and restore trust and integrity in the Manhattan DA's office.
What's your view on police unions and how do they fit into this national discourse that we're having?
So police unions are incredibly powerful. And I think it's one of the reasons why you're finally hearing about all of them, because we've seen this kind of police misconduct that has existed for a really long time, forever, in fact, across the country. But the police unions have a ton of power, a ton of money, and they've shown overwhelming hostility to even the mildest reforms or accountability measures. And so it is going to be extremely tough to go up against a police union. And that's, I think, why so many district attorneys really shy away from these, speaking out against the police, because they know how powerful these police unions are. But I think as someone who's always been outspoken against the police, like this is no change for me. And I've sworn off all police money. I will not take a single penny from law enforcement or their unions. And so that's how I'll continue to operate. And I think that this is, holding them accountable and prioritizing reform is something that really matters to me, and will be my top priority as district attorney.
When we have these national flare-ups where there's a really awful event that happens and there becomes a national discussion and uproar about it, it seems like there's a discussion with the mayor and it seems like there's reform that's proposed, and then when the cameras go away, the police union comes out and says, actually, there's no way we're going to do this.
I do think that those conversations have been attempted. I don't think that everyone's just calling for reform without speaking to the police, but they just have shown truly overwhelming hostility to even the mildest of reforms or accountability measures. And so I think that there's maybe less of a difference in some of these things than they would even realize, but they're so resistant to even listening. Because, for example, if we stop asking them to prosecute and arrest people for low-level drug offenses, or stop arresting people for being mentally ill or poor, stop asking them to be social workers. Maybe they would actually be better off, but they are just, really hostile to even having those conversations.
So last week it was reported that an NYPD officer was charged as working on behalf of the Chinese government to help find Tibetan dissidents and track them. It's also been reported that there's a gang within the LAPD called the Banditos, and there's been, over a decade's worth of warnings about white supremacist infiltration of police. How does that, when I hear those stories, like, how does that change the story for you, or does it change the story for you? And how does it, when I hear it, it just feels like it adds such a layer of complexity and chaos to an already very contentious discussion. Just wondering what your take is.
So some of those cases, that are brought federally, but I do think that, I've been asked whether I believe there are white supremacists within the NYPD, and I say absolutely. I mean, their leader came out and endorsed Donald Trump, who won't condemn white supremacy, who in fact tells the Proud Boys to stand by and stand up, or whatever the phrase is, and has really incited violence across the country. So I think that that's, quite clear. And I think that that's very challenging. And I think, at least speaking to it from the part of, the future elected district attorney of Manhattan, I think there's a moral obligation to engage in cases of police misconduct that rise to the level of a crime, or even cases where it doesn't, but there is misconduct, and there needs to be accountability. And so, the community has the right to know who they're interacting with. And the taxpayers of New York have the right to know about the misconduct of the officers whose salary and civil rights lawsuit settlements and judgments they fund. So, the city of New York has paid out nearly $250 million in NYPD related lawsuits in the last fiscal year. So, such a minuscule number of those cases were even actually prosecuted. And so even when it falls below the level of a crime, I think that the Manhattan District Attorney's Office has an obligation to get involved, to there's action that is warranted. And I will make sure that those lists are public, that there's transparency. I'll support the Civilian Complaint Review Board in bringing actions against the NYPD, and share that information in my office and with the defense attorneys who go up against it.
To switch gears a little bit and talk about your background, I was reading an interview that you said you split your time between Beijing and New York. How did that experience affect you? How does it change your worldview?
So I was born and raised in Manhattan, and I have a sister who's Chinese. She's adopted, and I also lived in Beijing when I was younger. And I think having that experience really did shape me a lot as a young child, because when I lived in China in the 80s, there weren't very many Caucasians living there. And so I looked different. People would touch me and point at me and, be like,她的眼睛这么大? Her eyes are so big, because it's true. I have very big eyes, and it would be, there was an otherness about me. And then I also recognized that we were back in New York, and I would go pick my sister up from school to walk her home, and she'd be crying after class and would say that kids were using racial slurs against her and pulling their eyes to the side and making fun of her and bullying her for being different. And so I recognized very early on the privilege of my white skin and the basically racism that exists towards so many people in our country. And I always stood up for my sister and felt the obligation to stand up, for all people. And I think that, combined with the fact that I knew at a young age, the reason that my family is in New York is because my grandmother escaped from France in 1940, as someone who was Jewish, who was being persecuted, and, other family members were killed, but she was able to escape the Holocaust, come through Ellis Island, end up in New York, and meet my grandfather. And so, I knew from a young age that persecution, based on something that you were just born as, something that was just part of you, existed in this world. And that was something that we always needed to fight against. probably is what made me become a public defender and what has, continued me on this fight against injustice.
That's interesting that you brought up your grandmother. Do you think that she would have any advice for you in this era?
My grandmother would be beside herself, seeing what exists right now. She was an outspoken advocate for all people, for women. She volunteered at Planned Parenthood her entire adult life, basically. And, seeing these Supreme Court hearings that are going on right now would be incredibly upsetting to her. The idea that there would be a threat to Roe would be just devastating. She would be so upset seeing, the rise in anti-Semitism across the United States, across the world. She would be devastated by seeing the, police brutality that exists towards people of color. And I don't even know what advice she would give, but she'd be proud of me for running and trying to change this.
What do you love about New York? Like, what's your favorite New York afternoon?
I mean, I love New York so much. I jokingly say, I wear my New York City subway token around my neck. I'm like, I keep it close to my heart because New York is my religion. But I think New York is one of those places that you can just have these amazing serendipitous experiences. You could be, walking down the street in the West Village and bump into someone, which in a city of this many people is just such a wild thing to have happen, and end up, outdoors at a park and on the water. And you can be at a beach in an hour on public transportation. It's just, New York is the best. It's the greatest city in the world. You can eat all the best food. You can feel like you're in a different country and go have local fare from probably, I can't even imagine, dozens, hundreds of different cuisines. And it's just my heart.
So you announced your candidacy before COVID, and then the pandemic happened. So you had to switch gears a little bit. Can you talk about that experience?
I launched my campaign back on March 5th, which was theoretically pre-COVID here in New York. And about a week later, we were completely shut down, remote, digital, everything, all of the plans I had made, a lifetime of perfecting a really strong handshake. And, now I'll never use it again. But it's just been a real transition. We thought we'd be knocking on doors and in the subway and handing out literature and shaking people's hands and talking to people and gathering in people's apartments and doing events and fundraisers and being with lots of folks. And instead, I've been really right in this very spot for most of my campaign. And so we've really had to figure out how to pivot, how to operate, how to do things digitally, how to still get the word out, how to reach people. And I think that in a way, the fact that I'm such an out of the box candidate, I'm not a politician. I'm not someone who really thought I would end up in politics. I've only ever worked on a campaign in a volunteer capacity before I became a candidate. And
Which one?
and so this has been a huge transition, but I think that has also made it really great for this time of having to be creative and come up with ways to reach people and engage people and help people understand how important this is. And so I feel really proud of what we've been able to accomplish in the last 7 months, in spite of everything that's been going on in the world.
Is there a favorite way or unexpected way that you've been able to reach people?
Fun fact about me is that I appeared on a couple reality television shows, 2 seasons of Survivor and a season of The Amazing Race. And, those are the kinds of things that I thought would preclude me from ever having a career in politics. But instead, really what matters is the fact that I've spent my entire career in the trenches as a public defender fighting on behalf of people. But I have really tapped into my networks of my reality TV friends to engage people who perhaps have never been engaged in politics. Maybe they've never made a political donation in their lives, but I really early on in COVID, I gathered, over 50 former Survivor contestants and put the word out and sold tickets to come hang out with them and do this big event. And we had 400 people join our Zoom event from across the country. And it was so exciting. And people said, oh my God, this was the best night of my life, which I think probably was an overstatement. I think probably it just seemed that way because COVID had really made so many people feel so isolated and miserable. But people were so excited to be part of that. And they came for the Survivor, but really got to hear me talk about why this matters so much and hear about the fight for for real reform in New York City and how that would impact people across the country. So people who don't live in New York, who maybe have never even been to New York City, are supporting my campaign for DA from their hometowns. And because of this digital world we're living in, they're able to.
Have you ever had any interactions with Mark Burnett?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mark Burnett was the executive producer and creator of Survivor, but also of The Apprentice. And so this kind of false version of Trump as like a businessman who is successful on NBC really, I think, misled the American people as to who this con man really was. Mark interviewed me the first time I appeared on Survivor. So I was 21 years old. And I can't remember. I must have met him. I did. I met him during casting before I was even cast on the show. And then he came and spoke to us like right before we started, but have not really had any interaction with him since. And I went on national television and I said that he created this persona of Donald Trump. And for that, I will never forgive him. So I don't know if he's like my biggest fan these days.
So your election, can you tell people the information, when they can vote, how to get involved?
Yes. So my election is June 22nd, 2021. So I know it seems like it's far off, but it's really not. And we need everyone to get involved. We need all the help we can get. I mentioned the donation limits. We need donations. We're building a really grassroots, people-powered campaign. So people are giving $1, $2, $3, $5, like whatever they can. They can go to elizaorlins.com and contribute, can sign up to volunteer, can spread the word on social media. We need all the help we can get because we are, taking on this entrenched establishment incumbent who has all the power, all the money. And this is an uphill battle. We're certainly the underdog here, but I know that we can do this.
Thank you so much for your time, Eliza.
Absolutely.
It was great speaking with you. Thank you for watching the Bullish Podcast.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Thank you for watching Bullish Podcast. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to Bullish if you want to see more money documentaries, how to invest, all kinds of good stuff. I've made a lot of it actually.